You're listening to the Get FireSmart Podcast. Here, we learn from FireSmart leaders to discover how we can increase the wildfire resilience of our homes, neighborhoods, and communities. It's time to Get FireSmart.
Well, Armel, thank you for coming on the podcast. Excited to have you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for making the time.
So you're right off speaking from your keynote, and so we're going to dive into a bit of that today. But before we do, we'd love to learn a little bit more about yourself and your role. So maybe for our listeners, just give a very quick, which I know can be hard, overview on your career background and what led you to where you are today.
My name is Armel Castellan. I'm a warning preparedness meteorologist with Environment and Climate Change Canada, which is already a bit of a mouthful, but I have my beginnings in operational meteorology. So I went to Montreal and did the course there after my UBC education days, and I forecasted in aviation. So really short-term forecast. The shelf life of my forecast was essentially 3 hours because you just kept on reissuing a forecast for an airport, and never more than 24 hours ahead. So really kind of detailed forecasts and for the aviation exclusively. And I was able to really shift gears and go to Ottawa for 3 years with a Canadian ice service, looking at iceberg and sea ice movement. So really different. Didn't even need to do night shifts over there because ice doesn't move so fast. And that was a really interesting, foray into Arctic weather. And finally, I started moving west again when my family started growing, and I landed back into what is a services meteorology perspective. And that's the warning preparedness. And it really is kind of tying all of the things that meteorologists look at for the emergency management organization point of view. So those decision makers are the client, and we are kind of interpreting the weather for their needs. And of course, there's a sidekick, which is to amplify that message for the public through media. So I do a lot of that these days as well.
Amazing. How's the conference been for you last couple of days?
It's really invigorating, really exciting, be able to speak to this crowd of consummate professionals that work in a world that is got a huge amount of focus on it, justifiably. We are looking essentially at a hockey stick approach to what is the wildfire season in today's world in Western Canada, but even all the way over to Quebec and Nova Scotia, as we saw last year. And to help in that world is, I think, an honor because, I'm peripheral to wildfire fighting itself, but we do look at the weather that will exacerbate wildfire conditions, the drought, the lack of precipitation, the winds that they don't need to be 70, 90 kilometer an hour winds for a wildfire to explode on the landscape. So looking at those things and hopefully making a little bit of a difference in their world, I think it's been really, really fascinating.
Awesome. I think it surprised me. I know it surprised a lot of people when you look at the FireSmart program, you look at wildfire risk, weather plays such a critical part of that, both in precipitation, wind, a bunch of pieces. So I think for you probably coming to this conference, weather, you're probably going to get a lot more attention than you normally do when you bring what you do up to others. Have you seen that be a constant part of conversations over the last couple of days of weather and where it's going and the changes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can take a lens from, the short-term perspective, which of course weather forecasting has gone a long way in the last, 10, 15, 20 years. Supercomputers have made it such that we're that much more accurate. We'll never be perfect, but the short-term forecast is, of course, so quintessential to, the battle against the elements, particularly when fires are erupting and there's pyro-CBs and there's dry cold fronts coming through the landscape. Everybody remembers the dates of the dry cold fronts because all of a sudden there's hundreds, thousands of lightning strikes without any rain, and that's when the season goes from bad to extreme. And all the way to the longer perspective, what are the antecedent conditions that have been building for, you could argue, decades in fire management, in the forest system, and just the precipitation deficit or the changed climate with temperatures so high that evapotranspiration are such a big deal. So to transpose those elements into more of a climate lens to what we can expect going forward, it's never been more pertinent for this crowd. Absolutely.
And let's maybe dive into a little bit of your talk and your keynote. We'll link to it in the show notes a little bit, but love to hear a little bit more of just what you shared with our audience, specifically around health impacts of cascading intense weather hazards. We've seen a lot of trends over the last couple of years in BC, whether it be at atmospheric rivers, intense fire seasons. So maybe bring our listeners in a little bit to what you shared with the audience and some of the key points that came from your conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a bit of a mouthful because cascading hazards in and of themselves are so complex, but I think the population out there starts to know that, for instance, the heat dome in late June of 2021 is not an independent event that doesn't affect flooding, 4.5 months later. So we can go from the deadliest weather-related event in Canadian history, upwards of 700 people losing their lives directly related to heat, and also some fires, of course, in Lytton. There were some fatalities and onward into that season, to the costliest event with the landscape having transformed, is hydrophobic. It cannot handle the same moisture the same way anymore as a result of the drought and as a result of burn scars. So these things start to overlap one another, and they're, year in and year out. We're still seeing the Elephant Hill Fire of 2017 have impacts on Highway 1, which is obviously a major corridor, economically speaking, and for people's movement through the province. Today, when, convective thunderstorm cells will pass over those scars and release debris flows onto the highway, close the highway, potentially dangerous from a human perspective as well while driving there. And so there's, that ripple effect that is really kind of tying everything together. So from that idea of cascading hazards, whether they're safety related or not, there's also the overlying, I guess, extra that we have not really seen before to this extent. So I'm talking about catastrophic wildfire behavior, the type of things that, our grandparents would have never seen this way. And now we're seeing them, for the last 7 years. And what does that mean from a health point of view? Well, there's obviously the frontline staff. There were 8 fatalities last year alone across Canada on the front line. And also the smoke itself. It doesn't get the limelight like the fires do, evacuations. But unfortunately, the science now, the epidemiology around smoke is emerging. And we're able to put numbers, dollars and cents to fatalities, medications, hospital visits. All of these things are adding up. There's studies in the US that tag it to, by 2050, a $244 billion loss to society in the US. In Canada, we saw Health Canada put out some preliminary numbers just from the 2017 fires alone, affecting the GTA 3,000 plus kilometers from BC and Alberta in the GTA in Toronto.
Wow.
And those numbers they don't look amazing, just adding an extra, 10, 15 micrograms per cubic meter of particulate matter, 2.5 microns, which is essentially smoke and all the pollutants associated to it. But putting numbers to that event just for the GTA, which is obviously a dense populated area, it is to the tune that is 35, 40 times the budget that was used to fight the fires in BC, to the better tune of $500 million. We're talking about potentially upwards of $20 billion in societal costs of that smoke. It's mind-boggling. And I think it's coming more and more out into, wildfire fighters that are obviously on the front lines. There's other people that are outdoor workers, tree planters, and then all the susceptible populations that, they're not next to the fires, but they're sometimes thousands of kilometers away. We export our smoke to the US. They've exported it up to us in September 2020. We've even sent it all the way over to Europe because of the jet stream, and we've inherited Siberian smoke on the west coast of Canada almost every summer. These are realities, and there are things that we can do. That's why it's so hopeful when it comes to protecting ourselves from the lion's share of these impacts, from clean air shelters, using HEPA filters, using N95 respirators when we're outside, and things like really powerful landscape management initiatives like FireSmart.
I mean, it's pretty impressive when you run through those stats. Maybe impressive is the wrong word, but I think you make it pretty clear, like everything is connected, be it the land base, you have a fire activity, and then you have a flood. And I've seen that even just driving through parts of British Columbia. You see a significant fire event, you're driving through in a different season, and there's flood and there's debris and you saw it throughout the province. And then there's the health component where you might see fire as direct evacuations on communities, lost structures. But then to your point, the whole conversation of smoke and overall health. So it's a really good perspective to put into place of how connected everything is, both the land and both the health. And I think, I'm sure a lot of people hearing that, it is mind-boggling, like you said. When you think about the stats and the numbers, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it is, and that's a really good summary. I think the only thing I could really add to, I think, the conversation around health is also the mental, health, the anguish, the eco-anxiety. Can't imagine the trauma of being relocated from all four corners of our province to places that are hundreds, sometimes 1,000 kilometers away. What we saw out of Yellowknife last year as well. Those are really traumatizing events. We start to talk in new terminology. I mean, I was on the current CBC with Matt Galloway a few months ago, and we talked about this as the term is solastalgia. It's no longer recognizing your backyard, your environment, as it used to be. And that's a true statement for almost all locations on the planet, but especially in Canada, where our temperatures have outpaced the global average rising temperatures by 2 in the south and even up to 3 and 4 in the Arctic. So the changes that folks have seen, whether it's the migration of animals and the food security, the levels of the changes in terms of how much ice and snow is on the ground, to the timing of when wildfires start. I mean, as we speak, there were just evacuation alerts in the middle of April of this year. So we're in a different place, and that is a traumatizing concept for all of us.
And it's interesting we're doing this conversation live at the FireSmart conference, because a lot of these conversations are happening in the other room. How do we be proactive? How do we introduce preparedness, not just response? So I think there's a lot of positive conversations that are happening, but like you said, we got to look at all the parts, all the facts. Kind of moving along the conversation, and you highlighted some of this in your summary, but can you provide an overview of some of those weather hazard trends that we're seeing and how they impact health across, British Columbia?
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of described how a setup, and I'm really not talking about a weather pattern that you can identify 2 or 3 days out is going to have, a really strong wind on the coast or in the interior. It's why is that important? Was there a drought? And now we know through forest health scientists how, say, a drought multi-month, multi-year sometimes will have an impact on the root structure of a tree, of a forest stand, and could be so much more susceptible to toppling and affecting things as simple as the power grid. I mean, BC Hydro and Fortis have lots of infrastructure. Most of it is next to trees in BC. We have so many. The impacts on people's health can be as indirect as power outages for sometimes 2 weeks in the middle of winter with a big storm. We've talked about smoke. I mean, this smoke is, for me, it's up there as one of the most important things we can talk about, because we will see these heat events. We'll see dryness over the summer months and culminating in these wildfires. That's not going away anytime soon. And with that is an enormous amount of smoke going into the atmosphere and eventually into a lot of people's lungs. And we're only really starting to understand the long-term impacts. There's short-term impacts on respiratory illness, anybody who's got asthma, but even understanding that a fine particle of smoke is so small, it goes deep into your lungs, into the alveoli sacs, and is moved into the bloodstream. So it's not just a respiratory exacerbation, it is also all of the other organs, including your brain, including the potential for cardiovascular impacts to your health, diabetes. The list is extremely long, and unfortunately, the vulnerable to those things are pregnant women, young, old, all the pre-existing cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses that people have. So it really is so wide-reaching, and really explains why this has such a big economic number associated to it.
Yeah, and you highlight it. I mean, it's when you go through the explanation of smoke, and even that's one piece of it, it is pretty intense when you just digest short-term and long-term effects. And I think you kind of spoke to already, but some of the most vulnerable populations in BC, you mentioned people with respiratory issues, pregnant, maybe remote communities, etc. Some of these weather hazards are significantly impacting their life. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit in regards to kind of vulnerable populations in BC and the cascading intense weather hazards and how much of an impact they have on kind of select groups?
Yeah, it's a great thing to highlight. And, I'd say we're right now in the traditional territories of the K'ch'lee'tene First Nations. First Nations across the planet, but in Canada, absolutely bear the brunt of the exposure and the vulnerability to a lot of the hazards that we're facing. The First Nations would be the group that is often on floodplains, sometimes really close to forests, in places that are perhaps impoverished, and kind of the forced colonial settlement model that was really pushed. And that alone bears acknowledgement. And yeah, the list then grows quite quickly when you think about who is most susceptible to the heat, sometimes the heat and the smoke. So sometimes you have to make a decision, which one affects you more? And we had really serious conversations with the BC CDC and Dr. Bonnie Henry to figure out, what do you do when there's a smoke and a heat event concurrently? Do you open up the windows to allow the heat of the evening to release out of the structure to bring the temperature down? But to the loss of air quality indoors. And that's a very difficult conversation because it's not a blanket answer for everybody.
Every household will be different.
That's right. It will be different.
What was the answer, out of curiosity? Is it every household's different if you have respiratory issues?
That's right. So yeah, knowing ahead of time and having planned these things, do you have the capacity to filter the air in your house with a filter, or even a box fan with a filter duct tape to the side? And will that be something that really changes the impact to your personal health or the health of the folks that you're caring for? Or how insulated is your home, and is it able to withstand, is it a 3-day, is it a 5-day heat event? Are the temperatures going to rise up overnight into even once they get closer to 26 or 31 degrees indoor, as we saw in so many houses in June of 2021? That can be quite deadly for the elderly, for folks who are susceptible to heat. So it really is dependent, and the plan for a lot of people is that there are inadequate housing, whether there's not enough green space to kind of cool the urban heat island in an urban environment. Do they have access to a clean air shelter or a cooling center, or both in some cases in public buildings? And are they open overnight? Or is this going to be a burden for their families to bear because they're going to go to the hospital, and that's a big, taxpayer problem as well. It's extremely expensive to the healthcare industry as well.
I guess looking back a little bit, you mentioned this earlier in the conversation about maybe our grandparents didn't experience this severe weather environments or events. What has changed over the last, 5, 6, 7? I mean, you've been in this industry for a while, looking at weather pretty closely, more than most. You've probably seen certain trends and changes. Obviously, words like climate change come up. Obviously, words like, we're growing more to the interface. So communities are now embedded in areas of the province where previously weren't. So, maybe it's an easy question, maybe it's not. What has changed a lot over the last several years, or what are some trends that you're seeing that's put us in a situation where we are today, where we've got these challenging environments?
Yeah, and it's a big topic, climate change, the changed climate, and also where we're going. the longer answer is really around what can we say about certain events? Because today with the academic circle, we can put numbers to events, and it's called an attribution study. So the events in 2021, become 150 times more likely to have heat events like we saw, which was essentially an unprecedented event in today's climate, comparing that to the pre-industrialized climate. So we can run models that really tease out the probabilities, and it shows at which point things have changed. There's a lot of events that are impossible to clearly define as climate change, whether it's a tornado or a really big strong wind event. You can't always just say, oh, this is climate change, but you can expect, higher frequency of many of these events, higher intensity, and also longer duration. So that's true for things like atmospheric rivers, which, it's a lot of jargon. It's a lot for people to digest, that actually atmospheric rivers, meteorologists have been talking about since the late 90s, that we've had them forever. In fact, we get every year anywhere between 30 and 40 of them, but now they're just getting stronger. The potential for the atmosphere to hold more moisture because it's warmer is there. And so we are expecting to see storms like that bring that much more moisture at a higher frequency, and to also sometimes stall on the coast. So it will be, it's something that we already are seeing, but also that we expect more of. And that's where we're kind of at that fine balance of weighing what we're seeing in terms of record-breaking events and having to adapt to them in real time sometimes, also prepare for them with, the dynamic of the FireSmart program is that it's both, small scale, community scale, provincial scale, national scale, and done over weeks and years. And so I find that there's a lot of hope to see all this coalescing around things that we can do. All these collaborations are very powerful. We've collaborated with Health Canada, the BC CDC, to create the Air Quality Health Index, for instance. This is a tool that you can use that is health-based in terms of what behavior does one need to take when poor air quality is either forecast or present, and it speaks to people's vulnerabilities. So if you are asthmatic, you know that at moderate air quality health index values, you are more susceptible to the call to action that is necessary to keep yourself safe. Whereas, a healthy adult that's not pregnant, that is able to still perhaps do some light exercise outside up into a certain other threshold. And so people can manage their health accordingly with a lot of these tools that we have.
You made a couple great points there. I think one thing that caught me in a unique way was, when unprecedented events become precedented, like people are saying that's our new normal, it causes you to start to think, how do we approach resiliency? How do we approach programs? You made some really good points of, interagency partnerships, which we'll speak to in a little bit. But I guess a question for you would be, how can communities and individuals really prepare for and respond to intense weather events to minimize health risks? So maybe they're hearing parts of our conversation, maybe they're reading the news and they're going, wow, there's consistently extreme events, dynamic events. What would be your advice, thoughts on how communities and individuals can actually start to prepare for, whether it be programs like FireSmart or other systems?
Great question. I think it's multi-jurisdictional. Environment Climate Change Canada has its layers of information, whether it's the alerts that are public facing, that help people stay safe, because it's really moving from just a pure hazard based forecast, it's going to rain or it's going to be windy during these hours this day, to what does that actually mean on the ground, not only for the public, but also the decision makers in emergency management, for the firefighting community, and offering that as, the kind of the short fuse reactionary and, heads up, if you will, but also zooming out of that and incorporating other agencies, whether at their academic, whether they are health practitioners, whether it is the province emergency management in climate readiness, are all offering various ways of being preventative for what is coming. And it is tricky to call it a new normal. And I've kind of grappled with this term with the media in the past because they love to use it, but really from a scientific point of view, we might be looking at this past decade and think, wow, that was the mild version of where we were going, which would not make it a new normal. It's not a step function into now we just expect this type of weather. In fact, we don't always know where we're going, at least certainly not for the next few decades. We know that we've done some amazing things at a global scale to reduce the Paris expectations from the Paris talks from a few years ago. And so there's realistic hope that we have a way to change the worst case scenario, which is extremely amazing to consider because it puts agency in the individual and in the community and the governments out there to know that what they're doing is making a difference and that it will, it's akin to putting an ounce of prevention to equal a pound of cure. And you can think about that in dollars and cents, but also the effort and the trauma that we are facing later, or can we put a little bit of pain and put in some effort now and how much it will benefit us. And these are not just fictitious theoretical numbers. They're real numbers that some of the professionals here are educating all of us on.
It's a lot when you look at all the stats, you look at the details and good perspective. We don't know where we're going. I think any good forecaster, and I've talked to a couple last couple of days, can give you certainty in, in the short term, but long term, it's difficult. And there's so many factors that go into that, which is, I think you talked about giving agency to individuals and the community. And that's a big tenet of the FireSmart program is how do you, it's easy to say, hey, it's not my responsibility. There's nothing that I can do. Homeowner, anyone that lives across British Columbia, anyone in Canada. But when you put all the stats on the table and say, here's what you can do, here's what you can do, and it's a collaborative effort, it puts a bit of an encouraging tone on it. As we start to wrap up, I guess looking ahead, and you've spoken to this throughout our conversation, but what do you see as the most pressing priorities, addressing the health impacts of cascading intense weather hazards across BC? So what are the pressing priorities that we need to address? There's probably many. So we could do a whole podcast on it.
Yeah, we absolutely could. But, really, if we think about it, we have to expect some pretty wild, high impact weather in the short term and also on the ongoing process here. And I would say that as a result of knowing that it's on its way and that we have to expect, an extreme heat emergency, continued drought, whether it's the fish dealing with temperatures in the streams, whether it's farmers, needing to access water and storing it for later in the summer when there will be none in those streams that they normally access. There's a lot of different ways to understand where the priority is. And I think, it's a matter of individualizing it a little bit, which is part of an education campaign. And it's about finding momentum in those adaptation strategies. So at the federal level, we have an adaptation strategy for the first time, which is great and super exciting. And it's not to say that we don't mitigate our way out of this problem, but that's a global challenge at a much bigger scale than any individual. And we are seeing, great federal and partnerships internationally, but down to, everybody's kind of day-to-day sphere of influence, whether it's understanding that you can do it yourself, put a filter on a square fan and duct tape it together, and that could be the difference between a hospital visit and not, or, looking at ways of just knowing who's in the community that can take you in and put you in their basement for a couple nights when it's the absolute hottest time of the year because you don't have access because you're on the third floor of 3 in an apartment building, and it will get hot and there's no way to mitigate that in the short term. So yeah, the prescient things are to understand the risks and adapt your behavior to them. And it's a bit of a unicorn because social science has taught us that getting to that behavioral change at the far end of the chain of events that go from weather forecasts to weather warnings to they finally come true and you issue them, and do they make sense to people, and do they take those actions to seeing that change behavior and to keeping people safe, is a long thread of consciousness there. And we, we do our best to fill it and to fill it adequately, but it's just like weather forecasting. It's not perfect. It's not easy, but I think everybody is kind of grasping with the changes that are afoot, and it may mean protecting yourself from poor air quality. That might be the most important thing. It might be heat. It might be both. It might be protecting your property from imminent wildfire and giving it more time before it for first responders to get to you and to get to your property. And all these things are kind of jostling for position. And it's in some ways, that's a good problem to have. There are a lot of solutions out there to mitigate a lot of these different things and adapt to them. So I think we're looking at that right across the BC landscape.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you spoke about just the transfer of social change and how long it takes from, forecasting and imminent events to actually making behavioral change. A lot of that's kind of built around FireSmart as well.
Right.
How do you create urgency? How do you create demand and excitement to make change, behavioral change in advance of certain events? So there's a lot of correlation between what you just shared from a health and a climate and a negative impact to how do we hear that, be proactive about it, prioritize and make changes. It's very integrated with, sounds like the FireSmart story.
Totally. And I think we heard a couple times today and yesterday how, there's apprehension about how do you do something that is helping your neighbor, is helping yourself and your neighbor's property, but the neighbor isn't buying in yet. And, you can't force anybody to do things that are recommendations, but gradually, at a societal level, we have so few smokers anymore. There's way less talk, anti-LGBTQ between, what I grew up with and what I see today. I mean, there's a lot that has changed dramatically in, 20, 30 years. I think we are going towards things that are changing too. And these are sometimes the nucleus early, and we're starting to see it steamroll, and we'd love to see it steamroll faster, but it's coming, and these are positive changes. And I really do think that we might be talking like this, in 10, 15 years and think, wow, this was the beginning, and now it's ubiquitous, and people are doing the things they need to do to their properties to really fire smart them. And then that spreads to the community. It spreads to the regional district. It spreads to, a whole fire center.
Yeah, that's a really good perspective. I think we have seen shifts. If you look back 10 years, like you mentioned, certain elements that have changed a lot. And maybe we're in an area now where looking at wildfire, looking at weather, like we're probably insulated a little bit in our situation today at a conference with a lot of wildfire and, emergency preparedness professionals, but it is starting to change, and podcasts like this, content that speaks about what to do, how to prepare, it's going to continue to invest and build over time. So hopefully in a more resilient province, both from a health perspective, from a wildfire perspective. I really found our conversation interesting, and the data points were pretty surprising, both in a positive and negative way, but it makes you really think about, fire is only one part of the equation. Smoke, relocation, trauma. There's a ton of pieces to that. Any last comments you have just for our listeners, maybe takeaways from the conference, takeaways from anything you've learned over the last couple of days, and insights you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, I like the open-endedness there. I've just been humbled also by some of the speakers and the breadth of knowledge and really the sincerity, speaking or listening to the Lytton First Nations chief, Patrick, there was a breath of fresh air, in the sense that it wasn't about fresh air. It was about quite the opposite, but really seeing the hope that they're building in, what is Canada's hottest climate in the desert of the Fraser Canyon there. It's a really amazing story that I think is easy to be more cynical about until you really hear it from the source, and to see the hope that they're building in that community, in that First Nation, is really eye-opening for me. And I think that that's been one of the buzzwords around here, is the relationships, right? The collaboration that is kind of new to this whole, we really used to think that, wildfire BC Wildfire Service kind of independently was going to just put out the fires, and that was their job. But it's so much more all of society approach. And so that's, I think that's really resonating with almost everybody I speak to. And that's what really is super heartening. And I think that's what keeps me hopeful and really engaged with my work, in this part of the world for sure.
Couldn't think of a better way to end. I think that's a great perspective of, you talked about, it's not just one agency's responsibility for the protection of the entire province. It's multiple parties, interagency partnership. You look at your background, you look at other backgrounds, it's a team effort, and you kind of have to take a team approach with the challenges we're facing.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. We look forward to hopefully catching up in years ahead, maybe next year at the conference, and just recapping a lot of what we discussed and the advice and recommendations that you provided for our listeners.
Thanks very much.